Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Sheehan from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Formerly of Villanova University, I see some of my colleagues from both places here. And of course, it's good to be back home at Princeton with the James Madison family. I want to join the chorus in thanking Gordon Wood and for the work that he's done. For those of us who study the American founding, I think, hard as it may be, he's made us all better scholars and made us all better thoughtful citizens. And I also want to thank Brad and Robbie for the tremendous work they do here at the Madison program. We see a lot of it, and there's a lot of it we don't see, because Robbie helps his friends. And for that, I'll be eternally grateful. So this panel is on religious liberty. And before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to just say a little something about what I see as the problem of religious liberty today. So if this, let's see, the title of this, America's Once and Future History, an interesting title. I don't know who came up with it. But I thought about, on this panel, we're going to be talking about the founders' influence on religion in America and religious liberty. But future is also in this title. So what is the future of religious liberty in America? It used to be that civil and religious liberty went hand in hand. There's that beautiful quotation from Lincoln about that this is the land that these two things are intertwined. But today, civil liberty and religious liberty, which were once friends, and think of the First Amendment, I mean, there's probably a reason that this is combined there, have become, to a certain extent, enemies. Think of the case of the Colorado baker, Jack Phillips, or the current case of 303 Creative, in which civil liberty is on the opposite side of religious liberty. How did that happen? How does it happen that it's like oil and water? It's like Hamilton and Burr. It's like Johnny Depp and Amber, whatever her name is. Or even like the French and the English, or worse, an Englishman speaking French. And I'm reminded of something P.G. Woodhouse said about that. Into the free and into the face of the young man who sat on the terrace of the hotel at Cannes, there had crept a look of furtive shame, the shifty hangdog look which announces that an Englishman is about to talk French. And so, yeah, I think Gordon Wood is right that the French are French, and it will always be that way. And I just, one note on the last panel, what a fabulously interesting panel, and that we're facing that question today again of who are we? They didn't use the word nation much at the founding, but I thought of, as I was listening, I thought of what Washington said in the 1783 circular, when he says, we have a national character to form, that's before us. And I wonder if we thought about this in terms of national character, as opposed simply to national identity, if that might be somewhat helpful in understanding America as not as one people, but not one ethnic background or race. Just something to think about. So we have three panelists today, scholars on religious liberty, Phillip Muñoz, Mark David Hall, and Michael Breidenbach. And Phillip is the Tocqueville professor, I want to say full professor, as of a few weeks, of political science at Notre Dame. He is concurrently professor at the law school at Notre Dame. He directs the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and most recently he has published a new book entitled Religious Liberty in the American Founding, Natural Rights and the Original Meaning of the First Amendment Religious Clauses, which, by the way, I've read, and it's excellent. He's published this with Chicago. Phillip is also author of God and the Founders, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson with Cambridge Press, which was awarded the Herbert, can't read my own writing, Monson Prize from the APSA and for the best publication on religion and politics. Michael Breidenbach is assistant professor of history at Ave Maria University, and he's also affiliated with the program for research on religious and urban civil society at UPenn. He is currently at the Hamilton Center. In 2021, he published Our Dearly Bought Liberty, Catholic and Religious Toleration in Early America with Harvard University Press. Michael is also co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to the First Amendment and Religious Liberty. And Mark David Hall, whom I believe put this panel together originally, is Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics at George Fox University. He's also affiliated with the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's affiliated with Baylor University and also with George Mason. His most recent book is titled Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land: How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans. So join me in welcoming our panel, and Phillip will start.
Thank you, Colleen, and good afternoon. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, good. Let me begin by thanking Mark for organizing this panel and inviting me to participate, and of course Robbie and Brad and Shiloh and Christy and the whole Madison Center crew. It's always good to be back here at Princeton, a place that very much feels like home to me. I should thank all of you, too, for not going to take a nap. I know most of us probably wanted to do, so thanks for sticking it out. Hopefully it'll be worth your time. Mark suggested I give a 10 or 15-minute overview of the book project, which is a task I find impossible to do. It took me more than 10 years to write the book. I wrote the first chapter here at Princeton in 2008 when I was a fellow, so it's been a long time in coming. So I thought I'd do something a little bit different and try to frame my remarks as a general overview of the book, but frame them around a question that I thought this group would find interesting. And that question is, what would an originalist natural rights approach to religious liberty look like? So an originalist natural rights approach. There are different versions of originalism, of course, but most all originalists start with the text of the Constitution. So for the religion clauses, the originalist would ask, what's the original meaning of the text regarding the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause? What's the original public meaning of the free exercise of religion? To make a long story short, I don't think there are clear original meanings to what an establishment is or what free exercise is. I spend a great number of pages trying to show why this is true. Happy to talk about that in Q&A if you want. But if the text is not clear, then where do we go? Well, most originalists will go to the historical record, especially the drafting and ratification of the text. If you do that, I spend even more pages doing that, I think you find there too, especially in the drafting record, it's not clear what the word establishment means, nor is it clear what free exercise means. These conclusions are not happy ones for the typical originalist. The text, I think, is underdetermined. We can know some things about the text. For the Establishment Clause, we can know that it seemed to be one of the intentions was to respect federalism in church-state matters. But even if that's true, as Clarence Thomas has said, the text still restricts the national government. Right? Before the First Amendment, in the territories, in the federal territories, presumably the federal government, at least using one of its powers, maybe Commerce Clause or necessary and proper, or some power it had, could conceivably establish a religion in the federal territories. but not so after the adoption of the First Amendment. So there is some restriction there, but again, it's not clear what an establishment of religion is. Same is true for the free exercise clause. When we go through the drafting record, we can learn some things, but not enough for what an originalist needs to do jurisprudence. Now, this makes no problem for liberals or progressives, right? The liberal or progressive might be interested in what the original meaning was, but at the end of the day, as everyone, certainly at this institution, knows, what the Constitution means in our day is what non-Robbie George Ivy League professors says it means. But for the conservative, it's a problem. We have underdetermined text. What are we to do? My conclusion is, in a way, Hadley Arcus is right. We have to go beyond the text. But then where do we go? I don't want to make Carson Holloway mad at me, but I think we go to the American Creed in the Natural Rights Foundation of the text. And so that's what the book tries to do. It tries to show that the text is underdetermined, and then take seriously, well, if we took a natural rights approach to religious liberty, what would that look like? And so that's what the book does. And let me sketch what I try to do here. The first part of the book tries to reviews the pre-1787 state constitutions. This is what I did here at Princeton in 2008 and 2009. It turns out, I think Professor Zuckert made a reference to these documents. This is no surprise to the people in this room, especially Gordon Wood, whose work I drew on in my own work. The pre-1787 state constitutions are a treasure trove, rich source of information about the founders' political thinking. And if you go to those documents, they all say the same thing about religious liberty, that religious liberty is an inalienable natural right. It's not every state constitution, but almost all of them. So then I try to explain, well, what did they mean by this? And I try to explain the founders' natural rights constitutionalism. In doing that, this is nothing new to the people in this room, but the founders distinguished, there's two types of natural rights. There's inalienable natural rights and alienable natural rights. So what's the difference? And what's inalienable natural rights? And so I devote a chapter trying to explain that and why the founders, and I use three individuals, Thomas Jefferson, who sort of represents the secular enlightenment in the founding, James Madison, who represents the best part of the founding, and then Isaac Backus, who represents the Protestant elements of the founding that are much overlooked. I say Mark's work has been very influential in me here. But it turns out there's a sort of overlapping consensus, whether going from Lockean secular Jeffersonian reasoning or biblical-based reasoning like Isaac Backus, who was the most influential Baptist preacher up in Massachusetts at the time of the founding, or Madison's natural theology. They all said we have an inalienable natural right to religious liberty. So I try to explain what they meant, the reasons, the philosophical and theological reasons that led the founders to those conclusions. But to get back to my question, what would this natural rights jurisprudence look like? And let me just sketch a few things here. For the free exercise clause, the book's key argument is that the founders' conception of an inalienable right to religious liberty is jurisdictional. The founders held that we do not grant government authority over our religious exercises as such. This lack of authority means that the state may not punish, prohibit, mandate, or regulate religious beliefs or exercises as such. The government has no authority to directly regulate religious exercises. But that's all. And in practice, that means that the natural rights approach, and this is certainly the part of the book that's got the most attention and the most criticism, the natural rights approach would not afford a constitutional right to religious exemptions from otherwise valid laws. To put the matter plainly, the baker in Masterpiece Cake Shop, the cake maker, loses on religious liberty grounds. There's no right to be exempt from the law. So Justice Alito, or as he's known here, Justice Alito, class of 72, is wrong in the Fulton decision. happy to talk about that as well. Okay. For the Establishment Clause, the transition from natural rights thinking to jurisprudence was a little bit less direct, but I still think it can be made. If we think about the text and design of the Establishment Clause, what they were trying to accomplish and how that makes sense in terms of natural rights thinking, I think the approach would be something like this. And here, the most helpful historical example is not Virginia, but South Carolina. I'll say something that's controversial, but I'm pretty sure it's true. I'd be very curious to know what Professor Wood thinks of this. Everyone says there are 6 or 7 states at the time of the founding that had religious establishments. Everyone says this. Clarence Thomas says it. I want to know what evidence the people who say this use. And here's what I would say is the evidence we should use. We should look at the state constitutions and see, does it say that the state established a religion? And if you do that, only one state at the time of the founding had an establishment. That's the 1778 South Carolina Constitution. Now here's my hypothesis of why 6 or 7 states, we say 6 or 7 states had establishments. I'm not sure this is 100% right, but this is actually why I think we say it. It's because Leonard Levy said these things. And Leonard Levy said, well, an establishment is when government funds religion. And 6 or 7 states, he said, funded religion. Therefore, 6 or 7 states had an establishment. But just to say something, to overemphasize a point, Leonard Levy was a partisan historian trying to influence jurisprudence. That is, he imported his definition of an establishment and imposed it on the founders. And we all think he's right. But he's not right. Only one state had an establishment, and that's the South Carolina State Constitution of 1778. And it's very interesting if you look at what they did in South Carolina in 1778. I mean, I think any entrepreneurial Supreme Court jurisprudence who happens to be watching this Madison program event might go to the 1778 South Carolina Constitution, and you could rewrite the Establishment Clause. And if you went to the 1778 South Carolina Constitution, you'd see there's and you can extrapolate to Massachusetts, which had a quasi-establishment. There's 2 types of things establishments do. And I call them state establishments and church establishments. State establishments are when the government itself is exercising the functions of a church. That includes how ministers are selected. There's a provision in the South Carolina 1778 Constitution, as in the Massachusetts 1780 Constitution, on how ministers must be selected. So these are state regulations of minister selection. There are official tenets of faith put in the South Carolina Constitution in 1778 that every established church must believe. And there's an oath of office for all ministers that an established minister must take. So the state exercising the functions like a church, that's a state establishment. What I call a church establishment is when the state delegates its authority to churches. When it comes to funding, the real issue was not government funding religion, but it was government delegating its taxing power to churches who could then raise taxes on their ministers. That was functionally an establishment. It was the delegation of state power, or to speak more technically, the subdelegation of state power. And you can see how that violates social compact theory. So in natural rights approach to the Establishment Clause would prohibit the state from acting like a church, taking on the functions of the church, because we don't delegate those functions, right, to the government. That's how it connects to social compact theory and the theory of inalienable rights. Or the state subdelegating its authority we give it to churches, in particular in matters of taxation, giving churches the powers to tax their own members. And that's not voluntary contributions. It means the church, once you join the church, which is voluntary, the church tells you how much you will contribute. And if you do not contribute, the church taxes you. It's not a gift. Church tells you if you don't pay, you're subject to civil fines or imprisonment. So they actually have the coercive force of the state. So that, I think, is what a natural rights jurisprudence to the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause would look like. Whether or not we should adopt such an approach, I think, is certainly a debatable question. My task in the book was simply to show what it would look like to give the arguments, philosophical arguments, that would sustain such an approach and hopefully allow us, both as a community surrounding the Madison program, but the nation as a whole, to consider whether such an approach would be worthy of our reflection and choice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the Madison program for inviting me to speak today, and especially to Mark for the invitation to talk on this panel on the founders' views, or the influences on the founders' views on the questions of religious liberty and church-state relations. I'm glad to be with my fellow panelists as well. We are, of course, in very good company. And these seats here, there are several very, very good scholars here who could talk about this topic. So I'm humbled by this invitation and look forward to hearing from you all as well. I've been asked to speak specifically about the Catholic influences on the founders' views on religious liberty and church-state relations. That, of course, presupposes that there were Catholic influences on the founders' views. I did write a book on Catholics in the American founding era, but I admitted to scratch my head a little bit when I read Mark's email. What were indeed the Catholic influences on the founders' views? Consider Samuel Adams, who's writing at the eve of the American Revolution on behalf of the Boston Committee on Correspondence, who's arguing that Catholics were subversive to government because they, quote, introduced that solecism in politics, imperium and imperio. I come from Ave Maria University, so I know the Latin here. That means a state within a state, right? Meaning the ecclesiastical authority impinging or interfering, becoming a state, right, within Britain or another state, which leads directly to the worst anarchy, confusion, civil discord, war, and bloodshed. I think he just lost ink after that. He could have went on. Or consider John Jay writing on behalf of the Continental Congress in a letter to the British people, charging that Catholicism, quote, dispersed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion throughout every part of the world. Is it likely that the founders and the political institutions they were then representing in these documents were influenced by Catholicism? I mean, maybe negatively, right? In other words, what to avoid in religious liberty and church-state arrangements. Indeed, given the history of anti-Catholicism in early America, it seems surprising that Catholics were granted religious liberty at all. So I think we could acknowledge the natural rights tradition that's operative at the American founding, but one could also hold a natural rights view, maybe not Phillip's sort of, historical excavation of the natural rights view, but a natural rights view of religious liberty, while also denying religious liberty protections for certain groups deemed dangerous to the state, the kind of danger that Adams and Jay are alleging. After all, that was John Locke's argument. Since Catholics pledge ultimate allegiance to the Pope, Catholics were subversive to civil sovereignty and therefore cannot be tolerated. Now, despite all the obvious reasons why it would seem unlikely that the American founders would be influenced by Catholicism about pretty much anything, let alone religious liberty and church-state relations, there is indeed a long tradition of Catholics arguing for just that. This line of thought has focused on the curious crypto-Catholicism operative in the American founding, like the 19th century Catholic intellectual Orestes Brownson, who announced that there has never been a state more in harmony with Catholic principles than the American state. Its founders were not Catholics, but they would have been started to have been seen how much they were indebted to Catholicism for every important improvement they adopted. Their innovations were, for the most part, borrowed from Catholic teachers. They had been nursed in the bosom of her civilization. 19th century American Catholic bishops likewise claimed that the American founders, quote, built wiser than they knew, a quotation that John Courtney Murray inaccurately quotes as built better than they knew. But the point still stands. Or that stubborn myth that the sage of Monticello had in mind the political thought of the 17th century Jesuit scholastic Cardinal Robert Bellarmine's political thought when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, a myth that, not surprisingly, seemed to surface around the time that Bellarmine was being canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. These crypto-Catholic claims are, and I'm speaking charitably, speculative. Contrary to Brownson's claim, I like Brownson in the main, but he's wrong here. There were Catholics at the founding. So if we want to know the Catholic influence on the founders' views, we should begin by focusing on those Catholics and how they shaped religious liberty and church-state relations at the founding. So to do that, I'd like to focus on the two main relevant parts of the Constitution, the No Religious Test Clause, Article 6, and the First Amendment. So let's turn to the Article 6. The most direct cause of Article 6 of the Constitution was Charles Pinckney, who was not Catholic and, as far as I can tell, was not influenced at all by Catholicism. Pinckney is what philosophers like Professor Robert Kuhns here would call an efficient cause of Article 6, the most proximate direct reason for the change. But that's not the only cause there is, if you would ask Aristotle. So if you want a fuller sense of the kind of causal ecosystem of the religious test provision, we must cast a wider and deeper net than poor Pinckney. Now, there were Catholics who supported Article 6 of the Constitution. For example, Bishop John Carroll published an argument against religious tests for public office in a Philadelphia newspaper as the Constitutional Convention was debating that provision in that same city. Carroll then published another criticism of religious tests in a very prominent Federalist newspaper right at the time that North Carolina was having its second ratifying convention. Bishop Carroll here is clearly trying to influence the debate about religious tests. I don't think he was decisive in that debate. His writing is more like what we might call a confluence rather than an influence, a kind of small tributary into a larger river. The river would be still a river even if that tributary was not there. So we'll have to look elsewhere. I think it's important to look at the general context of religious tests during this time. Religious tests in Britain and most of its colonies were often directed at Catholics explicitly. With a few exceptions, most notably Maryland, the historical inertia was to prohibit Catholics from public office, and that was the case in Britain into the 19th century. So why did the constitutional framers accept a clause, without much debate, we're told, that went against this long-standing prohibition of a particular group of people? What's more extraordinary here is that Article 6 is not just silent on the question of religious tests, it explicitly prohibits them. We could have just bracketed into some kind of limbo, right, religious tests, but it's explicitly prohibiting religious tests for public office. So to answer this question, we need to understand influence in a more nuanced or indeed more philosophical way than simply efficient causation. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe gives an example of a causal influence that is the removal of something. For example, what's the cause of a door closing? I mean, I could close it, right? I could push it in a certain way. The wind could blow it shut, or I could remove the door stopper. This is what Anscombe calls the causa removens prohibens. So in our case, American Catholics removed what was thought to be essential to their religion, namely that the Pope is infallible by himself in spiritual affairs and that he has authority in the affairs, the civil affairs of other countries, including abrogating people's oaths to kings, annulling civil laws, and other things like that. According to Protestants, and pretty much anyone else who's not Catholic, these beliefs made Catholics politically dangerous, and therefore ineligible not only to serve in public office, but to not enjoy any or most of the civil and religious liberties that others would enjoy. The central argument of my book, Our Dear About Liberty, is that early American Catholics denied this kind of power of the Pope. They were anti-papalist Catholics. So because they didn't believe in the kind of papal authority that people had seen them as politically dangerous, they therefore removed the central reason why Catholics couldn't hold public office or enjoy civil and religious liberties. There's even a simpler explanation here for why there's no Catholic religious test in the Constitution, as there was in Britain and continued to be in several states after the Constitution was ratified. And it's this: the mere presence of two Catholics in the Constitutional Convention meant that a religious test excluding Catholics would be rather awkward. It would be a performative contradiction. It also would have contradicted the will of the states that sent those delegates. Note that this explanation has nothing to do with ideas. I mean, I'm an intellectual historian as opposed to a dumb one, I guess. But an intellectual historian is a historian of ideas, and I love ideas. But here, Carroll and Fitzsimmons are not giving grand speeches or writing a famous memorial and remonstrance. Sometimes the causal story here is as prosaic as showing up, being there. So let's now turn to the religion clauses of the First Amendment. So far, we haven't found the silver bullet, the smoking gun, or whatever military metaphor you want to use that shows the Catholic influence on religious liberty and church-state relations. So I'm really disappointing Mark here. And given the sparse record surrounding the constitutional creation, finding that level of proximity, directness, intentionality will be rare. So here's what I can say. There were two Catholics at the creation of the First Amendment: Congressman Daniel Carroll and his second cousin, Senator Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who also signed the Declaration of Independence. Like their fellow Federalist James Madison, they believed that the Constitution respected the sovereignty of states to decide matters of religion. There was a kind of juridical or jurisdictional view here. So they didn't think that a constitutional amendment concerning religious liberty was, strictly speaking, necessary. But after Madison, for his own reasons, several reasons, proposed that first draft of what became the First Amendment, Daniel Carroll, that one of two Catholics, was the only congressman to support the measure explicitly and without further changes. His speech in Congress was reported this way: "As the rights of conscience are in their nature of peculiar delicacy, and will little bear the gentlest touch of the governmental hand, and as many sects have concurred in opinion that they are not well secured under the present Constitution, Carroll said he was much in favor of adopting the words," James Madison's initial proposal. He thought it would tend more toward conciliating the minds of the people to the government than almost any other amendment he had heard proposed. He would not contend with the gentleman about the phraseology. That should be the title of the next Originalist Law Review article. He would not contend with the gentleman about the phraseology. His object was to secure the substance in which a manner as to satisfy the wishes of the honest part of the community. Note that Daniel Carroll here does not give uniquely Catholic arguments for supporting the amendment. He does not appeal to church tradition or teaching, even though he can't help, I suppose, but speak as a Catholic. But he seems mostly concerned with compromise and conciliation. In short, he sounds like a politician. Indeed, he had already been working with Madison privately in correspondence that we can see to reconcile anti-federalists to the Constitution. And The record that I gave, the Constitutional Register, that recorded his and others' words, suggests that the introduction of the First Amendment was a coordinated effort between James Madison and Daniel Carroll, not the singular effort of James Madison. So if we want to call Madison the father of the Constitution, Carroll, we might say, is a godfather of the First Amendment, a kind of, not a progenitor of the First Amendment, but a kind of sponsor to it, a moral and political supporter. But let's take a look closer at the drafting history of the First Amendment. The Congressional Register, which became the official record of the First Congress, is not a verbatim transcript. We only get that until the late 19th century, this kind of verbatim transcription of congressional speeches. It is instead a mediated, editorialized language of a journalist named Thomas Lloyd. And in Lloyd's hands, Carroll's remarks were longer and more stylized, a kind of almost soaring oratory compared with the other statements. It turns out that Lloyd was Catholic. He had studied at the same European Jesuit college in France as Daniel Carroll did, as Charles Carrollton did, and indeed was taught by Bishop John Carroll. So almost everything we know about these congressional debates, including the First Amendment, comes from the pen of a Catholic. So when originalists turn to the generating history of the First Amendment, one of their most important records is from a Catholic who privileged the statement of his fellow Catholic. Now, unfortunately, Lloyd's sparse congressional record, otherwise, does not disclose Congress's reasons for adopting the final language of the First Amendment. But we do know that Charles Carroll was one of the 6 members to finalize the First Amendment. Now, given the history of anti-Catholicism in early America, that fact alone is impressive. But here again, we have to be modest in our claims. We don't know what Charles did or didn't do on that committee. I don't even know if he showed up. If he did do something, was it qua Catholic, qua politician, or something else? We can't know for certain, but if I had to guess, and historians are very comfortable in the realm of inference because that's all we have, based on volumes of his writing that I've read, he would have been particularly concerned for a fulsome account of religious liberty. And that, I mean, something like the right to express, to hold religious beliefs and not to be persecuted for them, the right to exercise those beliefs in public, whether it's public worship or public schools, religious schools, or acting with religious reasons in the public square, and finally, the right for religious organizations to govern themselves without undue governmental interference. So I've shown, I hope, that there were Catholic influences on the founders' views, just not the kind of distant influence that Orestes Brownson had imagined. The fact that there were Catholic influences in itself is extraordinary, given the history of anti-Catholicism. Of course, we need to qualify what kind of influences they were, and be careful not to privilege them over or against the other influences that my fellow panelists have already discussed and will discuss. At the same time, I don't think it's sufficient to say that Protestantism or natural rights thinking or Enlightenment ideas influenced the founders' views. That's not sufficient, since those interpretations, it seems to me, don't fully explain how Catholics were included in and helped to shape religious liberty laws and church-state relations. So where do these Catholic influences and the Catholic anti-papalism that made it possible, where do those leave us today? Well, this is where I stretch my legs and maybe play a little bit of the contemporary political theorist or something like that. There are Catholics today under the banner of integralism who would judge their Catholic founding fathers as part of the problem of American liberalism. They argue that denying church-state unity and papal authority for their dear-bought liberty was too high of a price. These are important theoretical debates that we can talk about, but I think that early American Catholics' contributions to the founding show a practical way forward. In their experience, established churches disenfranchised those they were on the receiving end of this, those who refused to conform, and made hypocrites out of those who did conform, seeking the political benefits of conformity. These Catholics instead created a religiously tolerant colony, in the first instance Maryland, and codified two of the most important religious liberty laws in early America, the First Amendment, and before it, the Maryland Toleration Act. They believed that church officials, including the Pope, could offer guidance to civil authorities, but should avoid coercing them, especially in non-Catholic countries. And above all, these Catholics show that the practically best approach is to manage the inherent tensions of church and state, neither to pretend that they can be totally separated or to collapse one into the other. They didn't build wiser than they knew. They built as best as they could. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks to Brad and Shiloh for inviting me to put this panel together. And I hope you don't mind if I take a minute to say that I've wanted to do this program for about 15 years, but for family considerations, did not even apply until for this year. And this has been the best year professionally in my entire life, as I told Shiloh in a brief exchange we had. Now, I say professionally because I did get married and had children. Lots of good years, but professionally, this has been at the very top. So in the common telling of the tale, Americans were generally intolerant, maybe very intolerant, with respect to religious liberty until the late 18th century. And then the Enlightenment came along, and the founders became Enlightenment rationalists and decided to start embracing religious liberty and strictly separating the church and state. Or maybe for prudential reasons. People got tired of killing each other over faith, and so embraced religious toleration, religious liberty. I do emphasize it's a common telling of the tale. I'm not really worried that most of you embrace that sort of thing, but I've spent a lot of my professional career engaging in debates with respect to American political thought, where far too many people, I think, want to say it's simply and solely a product, the founding era, of the secular Enlightenment, a secular version of the Enlightenment. And so with respect to the American founding, broadly conceived in a book like Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic, or more narrowly with respect to religious liberty, I think what I've attempted to bring to the table is to emphasize the importance of Christian ideas and even specifically Protestant ideas. But let me hasten to say, I'm not into monocausal explanations. I understand you have Catholic influence, you do have Enlightenment influence, you have the common law influences, and so forth. And so part of our job is to muddle through and sort these things out. So let me go back to the very beginning, at least of Christianity. Robert Louis Wilkins, in his wonderful book, Liberty and the Things of God, argues that religious liberty is a Christian idea. Jesus Christ tells his followers to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. You can build a lot from the Golden Rule, treating people as you would like to be treated. Jesus famously doesn't call down fire on people who reject his servants, as both Peter and John would have him do. And when he sends out people and cities reject them, he says, wipe the dust from your pant legs, right? Now, Jesus had the power to call down fire upon people who rejected him, but he didn't. The Apostle Paul introduces the word conscience into the Christian community in Romans 2. And according to Wilkins, it was the church father Tertullian who's the first person in the history of Western civilization to use the phrase freedom of religion. And so I want to suggest to you that religious liberty is fundamentally a Christian idea. But Wilkins recognizes, as he must, that it's real easy to argue for religious liberty when you're a minority. When you become a majority, it's real tempting to use the power of the civil state to promote your understanding of true Christianity. And of course, this is exactly what Christians began to do with Constantine and Theodosius, and Christians to succumb to this temptation, Catholics and Protestants alike, well into the American founding, the creation of our earliest settlements. A Harvard professor, David D. Hall, no relation in spite of the similarity of our names, writes that on both sides of the Protestant-Catholic divide, theologians and civic leaders agreed that true religion could be readily defined and that God empowered godly kings, or as was oftentimes said, the Christian prince, to use the power of the civil state on behalf of true religion. He's talking about the 17th century Christians in this case. So American colonies were no exception to this. And we can maybe talk and debate about this earlier. I have written down 9 of the 13 colonies had religious establishments. But I go on to say those that did not have a formal religious establishment protected and promoted Christianity in other ways. And I agree with Phil that we need to really sort out what we mean. Let me give you a statistic that you might find somewhat surprising. In 1787, when the founders were in Philadelphia debating the religious test clause for the U.S. Constitution, fully 11 of the 13 states had religious tests for office. Only Virginia and New York did not. But don't worry, New York, 3 years later, adopted one. So this is still very much in play. It is clearly an anti-papist one, right? You had to forswear allegiance to any foreign power, civil or ecclesiastical. Or again, I think to Phil's point, in 1784, the Virginia General Assembly told the Anglican Church in the state how to govern itself. The Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty is adopted in 1786. It is not till 1787 that 1784 statute is repealed. And so, according to Thomas Buckley, if telling a church how to govern itself isn't an establishment, I don't know what is. So really it's 1787, not 1786, where we can count disestablishment in Virginia. All right, but the main point of that is simply that, again, Protestants and Catholics alike routinely turn to the civil state to promote their understanding of true Christianity. Because I'm arguing from the Protestant, for the Protestant influences upon religious liberty in the American context, let me take a step back to the Protestant Reformation and just mention a few things that you all know pretty well. I want to focus in on some of the battle cries of the Reformation: sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura, the priesthood of all believers. Now, the Reformers rejected the idea that Christians need a mediator between themselves and God. That in fact they had a responsibility to turn to the Bible themselves, to read the Bible for themselves, to interpret and understand the Bible for themselves. And so what you see within Protestant communities is an explosion of literacy. And Protestants are reading the Bible, they're debating the Bible, and because they have the view that salvation comes through faith alone, they come to the conclusion, well, compulsion really doesn't make a lot of sense in matters of religion. But again, I can see that the early American colonies, most of whom were populated by Protestants. Even in Maryland, I think Catholics were never a majority. In 1776, you have something like 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestants, or would have identified themselves as Protestants. 2% Roman Catholic, 2,500 or so Jews in 4 or 5 American cities. But what goes on in especially the 18th century, I think, and I think this is very important for my argument, is you have indisputably pious Christians who are making arguments based on the Bible and Christian theology in favor of religious liberty, and even in favor of religious liberty for all, not just for Protestants. And I have in mind here people like Roger Williams, William Penn, Elisha Williams, Samuel Davey, Isaac Backus, and others. And so they make a variety of arguments, so some appealing back to the scriptural passages I mentioned. Others are more practical or even theoretical. So William Penn, for instance, he makes an argument in 1675, which I think makes a lot of sense. He says, "Force makes hypocrites. 'Tis persuasion only that converts." And he reiterated this conviction, this sentiment throughout his writings, and he had a lot of writings on religious liberty, right, about a dozen years later. He says that persecution converts nobody. It may breed hypocrisy, but that is quite another thing from salvation. Similarly, the Baptist minister Isaac Backus contends in 1773 that where persons and each society are equally protected from being injured by others, all enjoying equal liberty to attend and support the worship that they believe is right, having no more striving for mastery and superiority than little children, we must all come to or enter into the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 18:3, how happy are its effects on civil society. Note there he not only is saying, look, this is good for religion, but it's good for civil society. So it's a prudential argument, not necessarily a Protestant argument, but that they would make these prudential arguments to go along with that. Let me just say, and I can give you a long list. I cut a bunch. I'm going to cut a few right now on the fly. If you're interested in a long list of examples, you can go to my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? I have a whole chapter delineating these. Let me just turn to Elisha Williams. as a religious revival swept America in the 1730s, 1740s. He published an important pamphlet, 1744, The Essential Rights and Liberties of Protestants. And in this work, he argues, and I'm quoting here, that the sacred scriptures are alone the rule of faith and practice to a Christian. All Protestants are agreed in. And we must therefore inviolably maintain that every Christian has a right of judging for himself what he believes in practice and religion according to that rule. Now note, this is a very Protestant argument, right? Sola Scriptura. Every Christian must turn to the Scripture to understand what he believes is true, and then he should act upon that. And I understand that's an argument that maybe only works well with Protestants. But remember, he's writing in Connecticut. In Connecticut, 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant. In Connecticut, it's probably 99.99%, right? So this is an argument that actually has a great chance of working in a place like Connecticut. Let me jump to one of the most famous exchanges. I know many of you would be familiar with this, but just in case you aren't, the great debate that went on in Virginia in 1776, where George Mason wrote a really nice draft religious liberty provision for Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He begins with what I take to be a theological premise, that as religion or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, in the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience. Well, that's not bad. And note how he's not saying because we're Enlightenment rationalists, or because religion isn't important, or because we are tired of killing each other over religion. No, we have a duty to God, and this duty must be exercised freely. Now, young James Madison didn't like that toleration language. He said, well, toleration sounds like it's maybe this is a gift of the civil state, and he insisted that toleration be backed out and that it be made clear that we have a natural right to the free exercise of religion. George Washington, of course, uses the same sort of language in his famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, 1790. He writes that all citizens possess alike liberty and conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the free exercise of their inherent natural rights. All right, so we can give more examples along these lines. I think by the time you get to the founding era, you have a consensus, a broad consensus that religious liberty is important, that it must be robustly protected. Let me dive a little bit, just for fun, into what exactly is protected. I think that it's indisputably the case, and in the words of James Madison, clearly the Free Exercise Clause says that there shall be no compulsion in matters of religion. I think a real interesting question, and Phil already brought it up, and I'll bring it up as well, because it's contentious even within a group of conservatives, is to what extent does the Free Exercise Clause require a religious accommodation, a religious exception? And I'll just put my cards on the table. I agree with Phil. I think it does not. But I want to hasten to say that America's founders understood exactly what religious exemptions were. They crafted them all the time, and including in one of our nation's fundamental documents. Let me just briefly address two areas in which they did so, really from a quite early age. In military service, I'm sure you all are aware of this, right? Every state required men to serve in the militia. And you run into a problem, of course, because you have Quakers and Moravian and Brethren and people who say, I have a religious objection to military service. And so this raises the question, what are you going to do? Well, there's a couple obvious things you could do. You could say, okay, fine, we won't require anyone to serve in the militia. And that way no one will have to act against his conscience. But if we need a militia, if we need an army, this could have it could lead to the destruction of a colony or a state, right? So that's not a very good option. You could do what many, many places do. I would guess probably the majority of the world's population lives in places where the state will say, oh, you have an objection. That's all right. Serve in the military or go to jail, or we'll execute you, right? The law is the law, follow the law. What you see in many colonies, though, beginning at an early age, beginning in the 17th century, is many American colonies say, okay, fine. Well, religion isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still have to serve, but we'll allow you to serve in a non-combatant capacity, or we'll allow you to serve in or hire a substitute or pay an additional fine or this sort of thing. James Madison, our famous James Madison, when he drafted what would eventually become the Second Amendment, he included a religious accommodation in that. His version of the Second Amendment would have had the provision that no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms. Now, if you know the Second Amendment, you know he lost that battle, and yet when he returned to this debate with the Militia Act, I think a year or two later, he fought for this religious accommodation again and got it. All right, let me just mention one other issue that was hotly debated, and all of these involve Quakers, and I taught until recently at George Fox University. George Fox, of course, is founder of the Society of Friends. Quakers have a number of distinctive views. Among them, they tend to be pacifist. Other Christians are as well, but Quakers are kind of famous for it. They also believe that Jesus means what he says when he says, swear not at all, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. And so Quakers would refuse to swear oaths. Now, this was very problematic in England in an era following the English Civil War where there were a lot of swearing requirements. There were loyalty oaths. Swear that you are loyal to the regime, and the Quakers would say, we can't do this. Literally, thousands thrown in jail, hundreds died. They weren't killed outright, they just died of bad conditions. Eventually, even a government could recognize this is a bad idea, and in England, Parliament passed the Quaker Act in 1696. The Quaker Act permits Quakers to affirm oaths rather than swear them. Now, that might be a distinction without a difference to you, but it wasn't for them. And they said, yeah, this is great. And so they were permitted to affirm loyalty oaths. They were permitted to affirm that they would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in a civil trial. But even though the Quaker Act said, you know what, serving in civil office is so important, we aren't going to let you get away with affirming that. And same with testifying in criminal trials. So Quakers could not testify in a criminal trial until I think it was 1833, and they could not serve in Parliament in England until 1833. Okay? Think about that. 1833, a Quaker could not serve in Parliament. In America, by contrast, most states began accommodating Quakers. Some, like Rhode Island, always a leader in these sorts of things, from like 1675 or something like that. And they had a wonderful affirmation provision that allowed anyone to affirm, not just Quakers. Now, some colonies would limit their affirmation exemptions to Quakers. Others would make it broadly available. What I want to highlight, though, is by the time we get to the U.S. Constitution, and among the many things the founders did when they crafted the three provisions of the Constitution that require oaths, each of these provisions permit Quakers to swear or affirm. And of course, anyone could do it, a Brethren, a Mennonite, or others, or a non-Christian altogether can take advantage of affirming rather than swearing. But in the context of the late 18th century, it's crystal clear that these folks knew what they were doing. They were creating a constitution that would permit Quakers to serve in federal office. The most famous provision, of course, the Article 2 oath of office, before he, the president, enter into the execution of office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm. So I just want to, again, and this is all in light of not saying the Free Exercise Clause requires religious accommodations, but the founders were absolutely aware of what they were. They incorporated them into the law, and so a Quaker could serve in Congress. Would that be about 40 years before a Quaker could serve in Parliament? All right, so let me just close, and I think I'll echo a little bit of what you're saying. I think clearly America's founders valued religious liberty, and just as clearly the religious liberty of many Americans, too many Americans, especially Catholics in the 19th and early 20th century, was not respected. So this isn't some great Whiggish tale. But by the time you get to the mid-20th century, I think we came to a pretty solid national consensus that, look, religious liberty is really important. It ought to be robustly protected. This is reflected pretty well in the Herbert test, which you all are aware of, 1963, which I won't go through. I'll simply point out that when the U.S. Supreme Court repudiated this test in 1990, Congress was able to come together. This seems unbelievable, right? To pass a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, 97-3 in the Senate, unanimously in the House, signed into law by President Bill Clinton to ensure that religious liberty for all Americans would be robustly protected. I'm afraid what we've seen in the 21st century, though, is progressives generally have veered away from and wanting a robust protection of religious liberty, especially when it comes to LGBTQ issues and issues of medicine, contraceptions, abortions, and this sort of thing. I take it people on the left are still protective of the right of a Native American to use peyote in a religious ceremony, but these other issues I find very troubling, and I think all of us must be concerned with protecting what many founders called the sacred right of conscience. Thank you all very much.
Peyote good. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
Way better.
Gentleman up here.
David Forte here. Phil and other panelists, speaking of exemptions, which you say is not in the founders' ken, as you know, the original drafts put forward in the what became the religion clauses also included a right of conscience, which was then deleted. Have you found out the reason for, number one, have you found out the reason for the deletion? And number two, if it had been included, would that have made any difference in terms of religious exemptions for religiously motivated behavior that may be against the law?
No and no. The reason for the second no is because the right of conscience doesn't include the right to be exempt from the law. What most conservatives don't understand is they don't understand what the right of religious liberty or the right of conscience is. That's the fundamental problem. It never was understood to be exempt from the law. Because this gets to the heart of what when the founders talked about the right of religious liberty, they said it was an inalienable natural right. That is the uniform language they use. And to document that, you just go to the state constitution, really the state declaration of rights. Everywhere they spoke about this right, they spoke about it as an inalienable natural right. So to understand what they meant about these matters, you have to, well, what's an inalienable natural right as opposed to an alienable natural right? Let me give you an example that will help clarify. The right of revolution is an inalienable natural right. Why? Because you can't turn over to the government the authority to protect your right of revolution. It's nonsensical. It's a jurisdictional concept. So inalienable rights are rights that the government, that we create, we do not give authority to. So the right of religious liberty pertains to what we don't give government. It can't mean what an exception to a right that we, or a power that we do give to government. It's a category mistake. And conservatives don't understand social compact theory, so they don't understand what the founders meant by the right of religious liberty, at least in the most precise sense.
Yes, thank you. Sahar Aziz, I'm a law professor at Rutgers University and also visiting here at Princeton. I very much appreciate this conversation. So I'm not a historian, and I'm curious to understand the role of various Protestant sects or denominations in the creation or informing religious liberty principles, because as we know, there's the intra-religious differences and the inter-religious differences that both motivate, right, people to perhaps agree that we all benefit from religious liberty. So my, again, non-history expert understanding was that it was really the differences among Protestants in how they interpreted Christianity and practiced it that motivated them in large part. And so then it begs the question of to what extent was the recognition of religious liberty for Jews or Catholics, and there was, Jefferson had mentioned Mahometans, right, in his speech in the There's a great book on Jefferson's Quran by a historian at UT. But to what extent are they really just accidental beneficiaries, especially in light of the demographics of the country at the time or colonies at the time? And that might also explain the disparity between the principle or the law on paper and the practice of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, and anti-Mormonism, which in many cases, especially with Catholics and Mormons, is what triggered litigation and the jurisprudence, right, of the First Amendment, especially in the early 1900s. And then we see it with Muslims, particularly after 1965, when the immigration laws have opened up and allowed people from Muslim-majority countries to start immigrating here. So the question is really, to what extent is this history really about Protestantism and the Protestant Catholic tensions that were from the old world? And if that is the case, does that in part explain the very contentious expansion of religious liberty by necessity, right? Because of the changes in the demographics of the country. Because I have had many conversations with people who, in their mind, really believe religious liberty is not for Muslims, right? Which is the community that I study, because there are people who have gone publicly and said, well, that's not even a religion. And they say that about Native American religions, and that that's a violent political ideology, et cetera. So even the conception of what religion is, and I'm talking socially, obviously, not legally, although there were people who went to court and said Islam was not a religion when they didn't want to build the mosque in Murfreesboro. So, I mean, these are all happening while the history that you're discussing is also, factual or accurate. So I just wanted to ask that. And then the last kind of more provocative question is, hasn't it always been the case that religious liberty and religious exercise has been in tension with other values? When you're talking about smoking peyote, when you're talking about polygamy, when you're talking about marital rules. There are many religions who will say, well, in my religion, I can do this. But in US law, we say you cannot do this. And so there's always been a restraint. And the question is, how do we define those restraints? Who gets to decide them? And to what extent are we willing to say, sorry, your religious liberty or religious exercise rights, not in belief, but in exercise, are going to be limited by virtue of various other factors, including that we're just so diverse.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to start?
Maybe I'll start a little bit from the deep history, and then we can move towards the present day. So, as you all know, of course, Protestants are a very divisive people because we're all looking to the Bible, we're interpreting it, we're going in it in different ways, right? And so I say 98% Protestant. As well, you could say, you could break that down, 15% Anglican, this is 1776, maybe 50 to 75% Calvinists of one stripe or the other, but this is Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, and then you have the Quakers, the Brethren, the Mennonites, the Moravians. Yeah, so it's a very diverse mix. I think, and there's obviously, of course, I think these arguments are becoming widespread. To my way of thinking, it's throughout the 18th century especially. Late 17th, throughout the 18th century, that more and more Christians are and I just cited a few examples, right? I could keep citing a whole lot of examples and ministers making these arguments and whatnot. So I think the argument is becoming more and more widespread. What we get in the 18th century is widespread toleration. Okay, we're going to permit, the Massachusetts Bay banned Jesuits and Quakers altogether. Virginia banned Quakers. We get beyond that by 1710. And so there's toleration. But there's, we'll let you be here sort of toleration. And yet you might not have full civic privileges. As I admitted, 11 of the 13 states had religious tests for office. And part of that is a perspective. I think they saw voting as a privilege, not a basic right. But I think the dynamic is at work, which is why the U.S. Constitution doesn't have a religious test. In the ratification debates, anti-Federalists objected. They said, look, this means a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist could hold office. And the Federalists had to say, yes, they could. Now, they usually would go on to say, but this will never happen, right? And that was not a bad argument in an era where 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic, 2,500 Jews. Obviously, the Federalists were wrong on this point. I think oftentimes, even in the 17th century, you're getting Massachusetts statutes that say things like there's no compulsion in matters of belief. So even the Puritans aren't trying to compel people, but they make distinctions that are still meaningful to us, which you kind of hinted towards at the end, I think. Yeah, we aren't going to allow people to harm others. And so when the Massachusetts Bay banned the Quakers, it wasn't because they were in theological error. It was because they associated them with the Anabaptists at Munster and the bloodbath that became. And this is very disruptive. And same with the Quakers; they're disruptive of the public order, and that's why we aren't going to allow them to be here. And of course, we still have that notion today that we're going to say you can't do harmful things in the name of religion. If you are a sincere Aztec who really believes truly that you have to sacrifice a baby, or the United States of America we will have famine and death everywhere, we're still going to say, no, you don't get to sacrifice that baby, right? There's a limitation on the basis of what it would do, not necessarily because of belief, right? So we reject the belief action doctrine. Let me say, and I'll close with this, I think people are still making that move. So those Americans, there's far too many Americans who say things like the First Amendment protects only Christians, or I saw a poll, like 28% of Americans think Muslims should not be able to build mosque on the same terms as others. I think if you sat down and pushed them, they would say because Muslims are a threat. Remember 9/11, the terrorist cells, hate is being preached. It's not necessarily, this is my guess, it's not necessarily that they would say because they are in theological error. It's because they're a threat. Let me just say, as a Christian who's written books like Did America Have a Christian Founding? If you read that book, you will see, and I know a book like that published by a Christian publisher is going to be largely read by Christians, and I make it crystal clear to my fellow Christians that religious liberty belongs to all, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and so forth. And I specifically take on that group of my fellow Christians who think religious liberty does not belong to Muslims, because it does.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else want to take that? Yes, Alan.
Hi, Alan Charles Kors, ex-University of Pennsylvania. Emeritus University of Pennsylvania. I just need to, I have a question, but quickly to get Voltaire into such a conversation as this. His explanation for why there was religious toleration, in the sense you identified it, in England, in his philosophical letters. I'll use the style you all do with the Federalists. Voltaire, Philosophical Letters 5. Fifth philosophical letter. Voltaire noted that if you look at the stock exchange in London, which he calls more venerable than many a court, you'll see the Quaker trading with the Church of England man, the Jew taking the word of the Mohammedan, the Baptist taking the word of the Arian. And he notes they reserve the word heretic for those who go bankrupt. And he concludes that letter by saying if there were one religion in England, there would be danger of tyranny. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30, so they live together in peace. And I've often thought that must apply to a certain extent to the American settlement, the impossibility of taking sectarian religious power once you had 30 religions. Question. As late as the 1960s, and I know this because I searched for a prosecutor to prosecute me under it, and no one would, blasphemy was still on the books in Massachusetts as a punishable crime. I assume that was the case in other states as well that had not yet resolved their updating their criminal code. But what that told me was throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, blasphemy was on the books. In Massachusetts, blasphemy was defined as a denial of the Trinity or of any aspect thereof. So you could believe in God, you even could believe in God and Jesus, but if you didn't accept also the Holy Spirit, that was blasphemy. So if we had a nation that had established a certain sense of religious liberty, what are all these blasphemy laws doing on the books throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th?
Rowan?
You know, I have a hunch on this. It's just a hunch. I'm not sure. It's actually a project I want to do this summer. If you go back and look at how these laws were defended, assuming you could find the records, I mean, other people in this room maybe that have done this, I suspect what you'll find is that they're defended in terms not of we must, legislate against blasphemy, but only in terms of public peace and order. That is, the blasphemy laws are not defended for religious reasons, but for civic reasons, peace and order. Is my guess. I'm not sure if that's true. Yeah. Because that, yeah. I'm not defending the laws. I'm just showing how I think they would be defended. It's because, well, it's that offends the community's sensibilities. What would offend the community's sensibilities? And is that this is I'm interested in this subject because my friend Adrian Vermeule, I think, uses blasphemy laws to suggest something that's not true about the founding. In fact, I think my hunch, and this is just a hunch, I mean, he wants to use the blasphemy laws to indicate that, there's always been a much more robust connection of church and state. I actually think if you look into the blasphemy laws, again, just a hunch, you'll find it actually, the passage in defense of the blasphemy laws actually represent a break or proper separation of church and state, because it can only be defended in terms of civic peace. That's a suspicion. I haven't done the work. Graduate student here, that'd be a good project.
The blasphemy laws in Massachusetts that prohibited those from denying the Trinity were passed by Congregationalists against the Unitarians who kept taking away the Congregational churches.
This lady in the far, far corner has had her hand up in the maroon shirt.
My name is Ruby Marie Marsh, and I'm at Princeton University. And I have a question for Professor Muñoz about how he said that the originalist reading of the Constitution would not have afforded a religious exemption for Jack the Baker, for example. And the grounds were that reading would only say that that the government is not allowed to prohibit, punish, regulate, or mandate religious practice as such. And I was wondering, because as a Christian, and specifically a Catholic, I find that my religion requires that I not participate in what Jack the Baker was being asked to do by the couple who approached him. And there are very serious religious grounds for that as part of my religious practice. In summary, one of the 10 Commandments is do not lie, so I cannot lie about marriage. In addition, marriage is an essential symbol of Christ and the church, with the husband representing Christ and the wife representing the church. And finally, subverting the truth about marriage, such as by baking a wedding cake for a supposed same-sex marriage, would be a form of denying Christ before men, and the consequences of doing so would then be Christ denying me before our Heavenly Father at the final judgment. So in light of these considerations, I was thinking that if Jack the Baker had similar reasoning, then we would say that the government was punishing him for his religious practice as such. So I was wondering if you could expand on your reasons for thinking he wouldn't have the exemption, or if you would change your mind in response to these ideas. Thank you.
No, I certainly wouldn't change my mind. I would say that you and the Catholic Church, which I'm a part of, should take property rights more seriously. And if they had defended property rights adequately for the last 50 years, we wouldn't be in this situation. Because his property rights would be defending him. You can't lose on everything and then dump everything into the free exercise clause, which seems to be the strategy of the people litigating these things.
Can I jump in as well, just to clarify my understanding of your position? You're saying the free exercise clause does not require an exemption, but Colorado is not required to have a law banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in a place of public accommodation. And so it could remove that law and Jack the Baker is safe, or it could keep that law and then statutorily add a religious accommodation, which in Washington, for instance, you have law banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but clear exemptions for churches and religious entities like Seattle Pacific. And Washington could expand that exemption to cover places, private businesses. And you're not objecting to that sort of thing, right, Phil?
Just for the fun of it, I will object.
I'm surprised. I'm shocked.
Let me push the point. The only way you get these non-discrimination laws in such an expansive form is because you offer religious accommodations. If religious people don't know their own interests, right? They say, okay, we'll get these laws that attack our character and we'll get exemptions from them, thereby conceding that the law goes on the books, right? And the culture moves away and that your children will hate you. No exemptions, there's no laws. And until we figure that out, these laws are going to multiply, and then the exemptions are going to be taken away. It's so obvious what's going to happen.
Can I just add here? I don't think blaming the victim here is the right strategy.
Victim? They voluntarily agree to these laws.
In this case, and I think obviously the legislators and the activists and everyone else writing to their Congress people and so on have done as much as they could do. The law passes. This is the next best thing. This is sort of the opportunity cost here, and so. I mean, I think I could agree with you, Phillip, on the level of, is this the right first instance strategy? But this is the cards we're dealt with. And so, if we're in a situation where, the lady has a fundamental objection on religious grounds, I understand there are good philosophical grounds as well that have nothing to do with religion as well for that as well, but nonetheless deeply felt religious grounds. Then the natural right to religious liberty is rendered practically meaningless.
Yeah, but it's
like,
not
like
true.
effectively
What you described is not
meaningless.
true. Let me give you a concrete example. Because everyone always accuses me of wanting the Little Sisters of the Poor to have to buy contraception. And my first response is, no one should have to buy anyone contraception just to hire them. Right? Secondly, when the HHS mandate and when Obamacare was being legislated, right? Before it passed, but once the proposed regulations that would cover contraception were released, so the law has not been passed, the Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops issued a statement that said, this is an unjust law. Right? And they cited Martin Luther King's letter to the Birmingham jail. And it was up on their website. Right? An unjust law is no law at all. This law should not be passed. It disappeared from the website within 2 weeks. And what replaced it was, we need an exemption from this law. This was before the law was passed. The Catholic Church facilitated the passage of the HHS mandate. As a matter of fact, and you'll remember that law only passed by one vote. Art Stupak. And that vote was cast because there was going to be an accommodation. going to stop the law from being passed. But it's not true that it's a second best strategy. It's the only strategy those who defend religious liberty advance.
Let me just say briefly, I'm very inclined towards your libertarian impulse here, but there's all sorts of other areas, right? Every state in the Union has humane slaughter laws, and these humane slaughter laws can keep Jews and Muslims from slaughtering things in a halal or kosher manner, or participating in certain rituals like karput. Every state of the Union, I think, but one has religious exemptions to such laws. And I'm not really a fan of just getting rid of all those laws. And again, I'm not even sure how a libertarian would think about that. Or think about conscription, right? I'm not a fan of conscription at all, but in a war like World War I, especially World War II, it might be necessary for national security. If you're going to have subscription, I sure want to see a religious accommodation to protect religious pacifists. And just as a point of principle, Phil, I don't hear you saying this is impermissible. It's certainly not banned by the First Amendment. It's just maybe imprudent.
No, it's not. It's certainly not constitutionally impermissible, though it is against the logic of Federalist 10. What does Madison say in Federalist 10, and then finishes the thought in Federalist 57? What's the surest way? The context of Federalist 57 is how do you make sure that members of the House pass good laws, just laws? He says the surest way is that the laws be enforced on themselves and on their friends. That is the surest way to make sure our laws are good. Now, the rule of law is not perfect. There's always going to need to be exemptions, right? I would say those are best done on a case-by-case basis through the non-enforcement of executive power, right? Prosecutorial discretion. But the rule of law is not perfect. But you can't constantly make exemption after exemption after exemption. If you want big government that regulates everything, you have exemptions. Let me just if it's not perfectly clear, let me tell you what's going on. The way you buy off religious opposition to liberal laws is you give exemptions to them. And that has been going on for 50 years, and look where we are now.
This gentleman up here with the red tie has his hand. No, you're looking around, and I'm looking at you. Right to your right.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Fernando. I'm coming from Fernando Simón, professor in Spain at the University of Navarra of Constitutional Law. Well, first, thank you very much. This debate, well, I find this debate extremely interesting because we are facing exactly this problem of the exemption in Spain with abortion laws and euthanasia laws and the register of objectors. I think that the problem is precisely that we have made a wrong analogy with conscription. Because in the case of conscription, which is the origin of conscientious objection, the case of conscription is a case in which you have a constitutional duty that you cannot object. But whenever you're talking about a legal duty, the fundamental rights operates first as a limit to the legislator. And by the way of talking of exemptions, you're assuming you have a prima facie duty, and all the presumptions. You have a prima facie duty, and all the presumptions are going to operate against it. Instead of in duty of libertad, you're going to face all presumptions against, and you're going to have to. No problem. In case you recognize the exemption, you're going to have to face charges to exercise your right, precisely because an exemption by definition requires a prior prima facie duty. If you're going to free yourself from a duty, you have to admit charges, registers, anticipated declaration of your beliefs, etc. I think that's wrong. I think first religious freedom.
Do you have a question?
Sorry?
Do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry.
For that very interesting statement.
No, so I just wanted to remark this and to ask Philip what does he think about this. But I think I fully agree with him.
Thank you.
I think for the most part you're right. I mean, let me just, since I'm I'm inflaming people already, let me persecute the Quakers while I'm at it. Look, what is a social compact? A social compact is a mutual defense pact, right? I won't harm you, you won't harm me. I'll fight for you, you fight for me against our common enemies. That is the essence of the political community. It's not just that, but that's the very first thing the political community is. It's a mutual defense pact. You can't be a member of the pact if you say, I won't fight. You don't have to join the team. You can't have a right not to fight. It's nonsensical. Right?
Okay.
And we're going to say, well, why are we going to make Quakers fight? Well, you should fight to defend your wives and children. And we should say that.
Rob Coons, next question.
One is, how do we define the word religion in the first place? We sort of danced around that. Obviously not Christian only, but what exactly, right? I mean, if we go with the Madison defense, duty to your creator, then it looks like only monotheistic faiths should be included. And if not, the question is, if we can't define religion, does that mean that the freedom of religious exercise collapses into freedom of speech and expression? There's nothing more to it. One of my former colleagues, Brian Leiters, argued that way, that there's really no point to talking about religious exercise. We don't know what religion is. We might as well just talk about free speech. So that was the first one. Second one, real quickly, do you think that the right of religious freedom, of free exercise, is purely an individual right, or is it a right that applies to communities as well? So I think Yoder's the only case where a right, as far as I know, that communities be given a sort of religious freedom right. But do you think, is Yoder right? Should we recognize the right of communities to pass their religion onto their children despite interference?
Who would like to take that? Michael, do you want to start?
I can start with the second one. I can't speak authoritatively on whether the First Amendment has embedded in it some kind of freedom for religious organizations to govern themselves without undue governmental interference. But I can certainly say that the practice from the very beginning of Congress especially, but also in the executive branch, the judicial branch didn't do very much in the beginning. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, as president, writes to some nuns in Louisiana and asks, who are asking him, do we still have ownership of our property because of the Louisiana Purchase? And he sort of flips the jus patronatus, the right of patronage that Europe experiences, in which governments actually sort of fund things and appoint bishops and all sorts of things, and flips the patronage question, says, we will patronize you insofar as we're going to protect your existence and your ability to govern yourself as you see fit for charitable purposes. So from the very beginning, we see Congress incorporating churches in the District of Columbia. That's not an establishment of religion, according to those congressmen, but it is suggesting that the articles that they are accepting say they can govern themselves indefinitely as they see fit, according to applicable laws. And so, yes, from the very beginning, I think there's a kind of what the medievals called the libertas ecclesiae for all sorts of religious organizations, and not just places of worship, but also schools.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman up here. He has his hand up.
No. So I was curious how many of this changes with the 14th Amendment. So we're all citizens of all creeds, have equal civil rights, equal entitlement to the consideration of the government. It seems like that's going to require exemptions sometimes for details. See my amicus briefs. By the way, I'm Chris Green from Ole Miss in 303 and the masterpiece. So, what about the 14th Amendment?
There is a problem with the 14th Amendment in that religious liberty is a natural right, so you don't have it because you're a citizen. All people have it. And the founders' constitutions are really clear on this. If you read the state declarations of rights, their language is precise. Right? All men, meaning all individuals, or all people. And so, incorporation is tricky insofar as it uses the language of citizenship. You don't incorporate natural rights through rights of citizens. So there are deep problems there. I don't have any easy way to solve those. We'd say, it's part of due process. All right. Then we're just in make-believe land. So.
Thank you all for a very lively panel.
Thanks to Colleen and to the panel. And I want to say how much I'm enjoying hearing the baby voices. Babies are always welcome in the Madison program, you know that. Bring them for show and tell to all future conferences. Now, our next move is over for official participants to the Nassau Inn for dinner. And of course, we're going to have our photographs of the classes going all the way back to 2001. And we'll begin those with the early classes just after 6 o'clock. So that's just 15 minutes. So I'd be grateful if people could move on over to the Nassau Inn pretty quickly, especially if you're in one of the early classes.